Welcome to James Madison's Montpelier. I'm Ryan Nobles of NBC 12 in Richmond, and we're continuing our discussion on the Bill of Rights with Peter Irons, who's the political science professor emeritus from UC San Diego and a graduate of Harvard Law, Tim Longo, the chief of police in Charlottesville and an attorney himself, and Stuart Harris, who hosts a weekly public radio show called Your Weekly Constitutional and is on the faculty at Appalachian Law School. We're going to talk now, gentlemen, about the historic significance of the role of freedom of speech, and in particular what the founding fathers like James Madison had to say about it. And Chief, I'll start with you. Why do you think that freedom of speech was essential to the founding fathers, and was it one of the building blocks of the entire Constitution?
Well, I think in any democracy, people have the right to be heard. I think the founding fathers, much like the courts today, want to make sure that people have the ability to be able to speak their mind, to protest, to petition for wrongdoing or grievance, to be able to object to something that's taking place. Just doesn't seem right. I mean, the very nature of a democracy is to not stifle the people that make up that democracy, but give them the freedoms associated with being able to open their mouth and express their concerns and voice their opinions.
And Stuart, did the founding fathers understand that without freedom of speech, everything else that we hold dear in terms of freedom would have been difficult to pull off?
Oh, definitely. In fact, I think that's probably the fundamental reason among all those that they protected freedom of speech is because without it, representative government doesn't work. You have to remember, when we talk about the founders, we're talking about them forming a government. I mean, first they had a revolution, okay, but then they had to have a government. So they come together to make this government, and then James Madison had all these wonderful ideas about separation of powers, but at root, all the sovereignty, all the power is with the people, and if the people can't speak freely, how can you have an election? How can you debate the merits of the candidates? How can you debate things in Congress and decide which policies you're going to follow? Freedom of speech is essential to the operation of representative democracy.
But there were some considerable restraints on freedom of speech back then, even after the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were adopted. For example, the doctrine of seditious libel, which the colonists objected to. Seditious libel is actually criticism of the government, and it was punished, of course, by the British government during the colonial period. But even after that, seditious libel laws remained in effect. We even have one now under the Espionage Act of 1917 and 1918, where expressing criticism of the government, creating what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes called a clear and present danger, using his famous aphorism of you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. That's a limitation on speech. The idea of prior restraint on publication is what I think the colonists most objected to. You know, newspapers had to be licensed by the British government, and it was finally decided that libel could be published, defamation, slander, that is impugning somebody's character by making false statements, is still actionable under law. So that there are those limitations, but the basic notion of free expression is really at the root, I think, of the whole concept of a representative democracy.
And looking back, Stuart, those initial limits that they put on, are those where we are today? Are those limits stronger? Are they less? Are they different than they were when the document was initially written?
Speech is still limited, and there are certain things you can and cannot say. I mean, classified information is one example. Defamation still exists as a limitation on speech. You can't go into a bank and ask for money at a point of a gun and say that was just exercising my free speech, right? So there are some limits that are out there. Peter mentioned seditious libel, and I can't let that pass without saying that there was actually a Sedition Act of 1798, and a fellow was actually prosecuted. Many people were prosecuted on it, and one of them was prosecuted for defaming President Adams. He said that President Adams had a fat posterior, and he was acquitted by the jury on the basis that truth is a defense. So sometimes juries will actually nullify restrictions on speech all on their own.
Right.
And this particular defendant was a member of Congress and was sentenced to 6 months in jail, and while he was in jail, he was overwhelmingly reelected in Vermont.
Only in America.
Did you? We've talked about this already, but Chief, there's no way that the founding fathers then could understand the challenges that we'd be facing today. But it seems as though they had a kind of an open enough standard where it could be applied even in modern times.
Oh, I think so. I mean, this country's come a long way. Technology is huge with respect to individuals' rights to photograph and videotape police officers who are engaged in public duties, provided they're doing so in a public place. There's no way the forefathers could have even fathomed taking a picture or making a video with a cell phone. What's that? But I think Chief Justice Roberts said it very well in the Snyder v. Phelps case, the Westboro Baptist Church case. He said, speech is powerful. It'll stir people's emotions. It'll bring them to tears of joy and sadness, and as it did in that case, cause great pain. But 220 years ago, we chose a different path. We chose a different route to take, to give individuals the right to speak their mind, even when what they say is offensive to others.
And Peter, have we seen other examples in different countries that haven't taken that path, and we've seen different outcomes as a result of that?
Oh, very much so. In fact, we are almost unique among most countries, even Western industrialized countries, in protecting freedom of speech. England, for example, has considerable restrictions on the press. For example, libel suits are very common in England, and it's very hard to defend against a libel suit. And then there are the Official Secrets Acts. So we are, I think, not to sound boastful, but over more than 200 years have protected freedom of expression of all kinds, far more than almost any other country.
Now, go ahead and boast, Peter. I think that's something to boast about.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.